So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for our commemoration of Holocaust Memorial Day. My name is Michael Newman. I'm the Chief Executive of the AJR, the Association of Jewish Refugees, and I would like to extend a warm and special welcome to our members and their families, as well as colleagues and friends representing organisations the AJR supports and works closely with. International Holocaust Memorial Day has instilled in society the importance of the act of remembrance and provides everyone with the chance to reflect on the lives that were lost and of the rich Jewish culture and customs that were destroyed, of the persecution that was perpetrated, but also of those who acted as rescuers and guardians. The theme for Holocaust Memorial Day this year is One Day, which also presents us with an opportunity to consider the role Providence played in survival, or the sanctuary that was given. The sight that met the eyes of the soldiers of the 1st Ukrainian front as they entered Auschwitz on the 27th of January 1945 was the beginning of the realization of the crimes perpetrated by the Nazis. And while Auschwitz is the most notorious and identifiable of the network of Nazi death camps, Europe is littered with the corpses of innocent victims whose only crime was to be born into a particular faith way of life, or whose beliefs were contrary to the twisted ideology of their tormentors. The deaths of 6 million Jewish people, including 1.5 million children, as well as hundreds of thousands of other minorities, are incomprehensible, not least because there are simply no records for some of those who perished. Like my great-uncle Max, who disappeared in the East, having been deported to Zbążin on the German-Polish border as part of the Poland action of the 29th and 30th of October 1938. And while we commemorate HMD today, we are conscious also that there will be specific dates that are precious to individuals. Like Otto Hutter, who on the 4th of December 1938 fatefully bumped into his best friend who had just registered for the Kindertransport at a nearby Viennese hotel. Otto immediately queued up and was designated number 359 for a transport of 360 that ultimately saved his life. As Otto put it in his AJR Refugee Voices interview, it was just sheer luck, but I had taken the initiative. Or Susan Pollock, who recalled the moment on the 15th of April 1945. She was offered a hand of help by a British soldier liberating her and others incarcerated at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. A moment etched in the memory of 22-year-old British Tommy Johnny Cooper, who noted of the liberation, "We stood aghast. We simply could not comprehend how it was possible for human beings to treat their fellow men in such brutal and heinous way." On International Holocaust Memorial Day, it is also our duty to speak out about the plight of those other communities who also suffered at the hands of the Nazis. The Roma, the disabled, the homosexuals, and those whose political views threatened the Nazi worldview, and also those who were similarly persecuted in subsequent genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia and Darfur, and those who at this very moment are the targets of oppression, including Uyghur Muslims in China. And while today's event is part of our activities to mark Holocaust Memorial Day, it comes at a time when we're still busy marking the 80th anniversary of the AJR by planting our 80 oak trees, many of which will go in this Thursday on Holocaust Memorial Day. All this also follows on from the launch last month of the UK Holocaust Map. Developed in partnership with the Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities, this digital resource marks sites of memory across the UK which relate to the victims, survivors, rescuers, and aid givers, and helps tell the story of the Holocaust and British responses to Nazism, something that features prominently in today's event. Speaking of specific dates, it is also curious to note that precisely 6 months separate the meeting in London on 20th of July 1941, when the AJR was formed, and the gathering on the 20th of January 1942 at Wannsee, which not only concluded with the formulation of the Nazis' Endlösung, the final solution, but also the classification of who would count as a target of oppression. It is, though, another aspect of what transpired at Wannsee that compels us to mark its anniversary. The 15 delegates at that infamous conference were instructed to destroy any notes and minutes of the meeting, but fatefully one copy, discovered after the war, remained. Through its existence, we know what was discussed and resolved. It is a document testifying to the incontrovertible and terrible truth of the Holocaust. This primary text, together with testimonies like Refugee Voices, the UK Holocaust Map, the AJR's My Story, and many other resources, are our weapons to counter Holocaust denial and distortion, as well as to combat anti-Semitism. Another resource is the dynamic toolkit against Holocaust distortion developed by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IRA. Our speakers today are also contributing to the ever-growing amount of material that both honors those of and what was lost, but also documents its importance for posterity. In a moment, to begin our service, I will hand over to Rabbi Gabriel Botnick from Belsize Square Synagogue to lead our service and give some introductory remarks. We will then see a short recording of 6 AJR members lighting memorial candles, our 3 speakers today, and 3 other members who we were delighted to congratulate for receiving awards in the New Year's Honours List. At the request of Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, we encourage you all to light a candle and put it in your window this coming Thursday evening on Holocaust Memorial Day in remembrance. The best way to watch this service is by selecting Speaker View, and please note that today's proceedings are being recorded and will be available to watch again alongside our other recent events on our YouTube channel. Lastly, let me also take the opportunity to please be in touch if you or anyone you know could benefit from our social welfare services and support. Thank you. Let me now give the microphone to Rabbi Botnick.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. I'd like to begin by thanking Michael Newman and Susan Herod and everyone at the HAR, not only for organizing today's commemoration, but also for inviting me to share my thoughts on this solemn occasion. I would also like to dedicate my remarks to the memory of Louis Snee, a former beloved congregant of mine from Los Angeles, who left us this past week. A survivor of Auschwitz, Dachau, and other camps, Louis told his story of survival through the documentary End of the Line, CSAP, and numerous speaking engagements to groups of all backgrounds. His life's story is heartbreaking yet amazing, and serves as testament to the power of the human spirit. He will be dearly missed by many, yet he lives on through the stories we tell and the remembrances we observe. Zecher Tzadik Livracha, may the memory of the righteous always be a blessing. The Holocaust Memorial Day Trust has chosen for this year's theme the idea of one day. This can refer to the one day when everything changed for an individual, a family, a community, or humanity. It might allude to a day that a father was taken by the Gestapo, never to be seen again. Maybe it's the day a family hastily packed up what little possessions they could, leaving home for the last time and setting out on a journey into the unknown. One day can be a reference to the day Hitler was appointed chancellor, and thus began the rapid decay of German society and Jewish security within it. One day can also bring to mind the 27th of January, 1945, when the Auschwitz-Birkenau camps were liberated, or the 8th of May that year when the war officially came to an end. One day might speak to a theoretical point in the future, when all nations will lay down their arms and embrace unconditional peace and coexistence. Within the Jewish tradition, we often speak of the power of a single day, usually Shabbat. But even more important is the power of a single moment. One moment. The moment we chose to cross the parted sea. The moment we chose to accept the Torah despite our trepidation. The moment we allowed our fear to best us, resulting in 40 years of wandering. Our tradition teaches us time and again that it's how we approach or react to a single moment that can have the most profound impact on our lives and the lives of those around us. One moment. One moment to decide, will I use my words to build up or to tear down? Will I conduct myself in a way that joins in the act of creation or hinders it? Will I learn from this experience or allow the opportunity to pass me by? On this Holocaust Memorial Day, I invite you to recognize the power and potential of every moment. Because we know if more people had chosen that path of awareness in the past, the Shoah might never have happened. And it is up to each of us to ensure it never happens again. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our candle lighters. I'm now delighted to introduce our first speaker, Hedy Gavurin, who, having recently participated in a unique commemorative project in Berlin, marking the milestone anniversary of the Wannsee conference, will be reflecting on the significance of her visit and how her life was impacted by Wannsee. Hedy.
Thank you, Michael. I'm not used to public speaking, so I apologize for reading the account of my trip to Berlin. I joined AJR in November 2020, having been urged to do so for many years by my friend Ruth Briggs. My late mother had been a member for as long as I could remember, but I never thought of joining because I never thought of myself as a refugee, having come out of Germany at the age of 13 months in August 1939. I had no memories, of course, of having been in Germany, though I was born in Stuttgart on 7th of July 1938, the child of Maria and Herman Buller, who were living there, although Maria was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Herman in Romania, both of their birth towns now being in the Ukraine. I received the monthly AJR journals, which I enjoyed reading, and in the April 2021 edition, I was fascinated to read "We Are Here," all in capitals with exclamation marks, about a concept, the brainchild of Dr. Julian Reitzenstein, a historian and lecturer who lives in Ireland with a particular interest in works of art and properties looted by the Nazi regime. On 20th of January 1942, 15 men met in a villa on Berlin's Wannsee Lake to design the Nazi regime's strategy to murder 11 million Jews in Europe. The plans agreed in Wannsee ultimately led to the murder of 6 million Jews, the greatest crime in human history. The survivors, however, were able to escape, and many are still alive, as are their descendants. Hence, we are here. 20th of January 2022, being the 80th anniversary of the Wannsee Conference, inspired Dr. Reisenstein to contact the Berlin-based artist Susanna Kraus, who is renowned for her work with the IMAGO camera, a unique walk-in camera, and they created the concept for an exhibition to open in Berlin on that date before touring other cities and countries. The plan was for 15 survivors with a grandchild or a great-grandchild to be photographed, the selected people being invited to fly to Berlin as soon as the pandemic allowed. Anyone interested in taking part was asked to complete a contact form. Acting completely out of character, I applied because of my admiration for the concept and feeling that this stark anniversary needed to be marked. I told no one and promptly forgot all about my application. On 22nd October 2021, I received a warm and informative email from Michael Newman, the chief executive of AJR, giving more details of the Wannsee Conference photographic project in Berlin and inviting me and a younger relative to come to Berlin between 15th and 19th November. I was both excited and nervous, the trip being just over 3 weeks ahead. I told my 2 sons, who were very enthusiastic and said that I really should do it. My 4 grandchildren all wanted to come, but 3 were unable to do so because of work commitments, leaving my youngest grandchild, Frank, aged 22 years old, very excited to come with me. All was agreed, and on Monday, 15th of October, I flew to Berlin with another survivor, Dr. Peter Brent, and his granddaughter, Serena, Frank having gone by train because of his concern about global warming. He was waiting for me at the Aparian apartments, which were very comfortable and stylish. That afternoon, we walked around the area in the southwest of Berlin, which is residential with beautiful villas and flats. On Tuesday afternoon, we were collected by a taxi and taken to the IMAGO studio, where we met Susanna Kraus, her colleague Danielle, and Barbara Kovac, who had made all the arrangements for our trip. We were made to feel very comfortable, shown the remarkable walk-in camera, which is more like a small studio in itself, and had the procedure explained. We then had trial photographs taken, the real photograph taken, and lastly, one taken for us to take home with us. I should explain that these photographs are life-size, black and white, and are one-off prints with no negatives and cannot be copied. We were treated so well, and the session took just over 2 hours. Susanna seemed very happy with the outcome, and we said our goodbyes, left the studio and walked to the Jewish Museum, which was not too far away. We did not have long enough to see all the museum as it closed at 7 p.m., but it is a wonderful modern museum. We then had dinner in Berlin before taking a taxi back to the Aparian. The next day was our only full day, so we took the bus to the Holocaust Memorial and walked around the square. The museum was closed for work, unfortunately. We then walked to the Neues Synagogue, which is now a museum located in the vestibule of the synagogue, the actual synagogue having first been desecrated in 1938 and then so severely bombed in 1943 that the main hall had to be demolished in 1958. The paintings of the original synagogue show a very large space, beautifully decorated and having many affluent members. Frank and I loved our visit to the New Synagogue Museum, even though many of the exhibitions were very sad and moving. We then walked to the National Gallery and saw paintings by important German and Austrian artists. Our return to our apartment was by train. All public transport was reasonable, efficient, on time, and clean. On my last day, a car was fetching me and the other couple at 3 p.m. Dr. Brent and Serena decided to go to Wannsee in the morning, but I was tired and nervous about getting back on time, so I did not go, which I regret slightly, Wannsee being the scene of the conference. Our transfer to the airport was good and our flight was on time. It was hard to believe that our 4 days had flown by, but we did manage to achieve a great deal and carried home the life-size photo carefully rolled up in a tube by Suzanne, a wonderful memory of an amazing trip.
Thank you very much, Hedy, for sharing those reflections. I'm now delighted to introduce our next speaker, Vivian Harris, whose father and uncle were able to flee to Britain, to the Kitchener Camp, thanks to the endeavours of, among others, the Central British Fund for German Jewry and the Jewish Lads and Girls Brigade. It is also a source of pride that the Kitchener Descendants have recently become a special interest group of the AJR. Vivian, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. As far as rescues are concerned, most people are familiar with the inspiring story of the Kindertransport and how 10,000 children were taken out of Nazi-occupied Europe and given shelter and a new life in the UK. Although the Kitchener Camp rescue story that I'm going to talk about may not be as well known in many ways, it's equally remarkable because in 1939, nearly 4,000 Jewish men, mainly from Germany and Austria, were given visas to leave Europe to travel to a location on the English coast, a journey which saved their lives. The concept of such a project was in part a response to the pogrom of 9th of November 1938, Kristallnacht, when about 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and taken to Dachau, Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald concentration camps. Clearly, the future looked very bleak, and the priority was to get as many men as possible out of the country at all costs. But where could they go? Following a meeting with the Prime Minister Chamberlain in December 1938, the Home Office wrote to the Central British Fund for German Jewry, the CBF, offering support for a transit camp in England if the CBF was able to find a suitable site. With help from the Quaker movement and with financial assistance from the American Joint Distribution Committee, known as the Joint, the CBF rented the Kitchener Camp, a derelict army base at Richborough on the outskirts of Sandwich in East Kent. The site had originally been a First World War embarkation camp, housing up to 40,000 men en route for the trenches. The CBF then organised transportation for the refugees and set about creating a community. Kitchener Camp opened in January 1939, and between February and the outbreak of World War II, it became home to approximately 4,000 young Jewish men who had arrived from Berlin and Vienna. This rescue was a hugely logistical undertaking. Yet within barely 6 weeks of the Home Office giving the green light, the Kitchener Camp was up and running. Pivotal in this were two brothers, Phineas and Jonas May. Jonas was the secretary to the Jewish Lads Brigade. Phineas was administrator for the United Synagogue. The brothers' background in logistical organization provided exactly the type of hands-on experience that this project required, and they, in their turn, relished the challenge of establishing the Kitchener camp. The first refugees to arrive had to work on transforming the site. They built or refurbished 42 accommodation huts, shower, toilet blocks, a dentist, a clinic, a barber, tailor, stores, and not one but 2 synagogues. So everyone could have a shul they didn't go to. Kitchener also had an orchestra, a football team, and its own newsletter, the Kitchener Camp Review. English lessons were compulsory, and the Kitchener camp had its own cinema, built with money donated by Oskar, the founder of the Odeon Cinemas. The Kitchener men weren't internees. They were described in government speak as friendly aliens, and the word refugee from Nazi oppression was stamped on their past papers. The men were given 6pence a week pocket money and 2 international stamps so that they could write home. It was also made clear that Kitchener wasn't an immigration centre, but a temporary shelter to allow the residents to make arrangements for their ongoing emigration to the USA or Palestine or Australia or elsewhere. At the time, Sandwich had 3,800 residents, and the doubling of its population with the arrival of 4,000 refugees could have been problematic, especially in a town where some of the leading lights of British fascism lived. The gentleman in the photo here is my uncle. But the local citizens were intrigued and interested in these young men who were polite, relatively well educated, and who spoke English with strange accents. As it turned out, the men were largely welcomed, and many of the locals visited the camp to attend concerts or to play table tennis. In fact, on the outbreak of war, many Kitchener men helped with beach defences, and as local farm workers enlisted, they replaced them, and fears about the influx of refugees inflaming local tensions and giving momentum to the local British fascists never materialised. The Kitchener camp had a positive impact on Sandwich and the region, and has left an important legacy in local memory. In December 1939, the British government decided that even though the men were not British, they should, if possible, join the Pioneer Corps as a non-combatant part of the British Army was known. The CBF was absolutely delighted because it meant the men could be paid by the army, so the CBF could stop funding the camp. Many of the men were keen to assist the Allied war effort, and Kitchener became a Pioneer Corps training camp over the coming weeks and months. My late father, Willie Reisner, lived with his family in a small town called Zelo in the east of Germany on the Polish border, about an hour by train from Berlin. The family were well known and respected in the town. This photo was taken in 1936 for my uncle's bar mitzvah. There were 3 other Jewish families in the town. They were all my father's uncles, aunts, and their children. My uncle Joachim and their cousin Heinz Philipsborn were the only ones to survive, and all 3 were at Kitchener camp. In my father's own words, after Hitler came to power, the daily contact with the non-Jewish school in Frankfurt am Oder had deteriorated continuously to us Jews. Most of the non-Jewish classmates no longer spoke to me, and very many of them were in the Hitler Youth, and they came to school in uniform. Jewish children were excluded from sporting events. My class teacher was particularly anti-Semitic. He completely ignored me in lessons in the last 6 months as if I was not present. He didn't ask me anything and returned my classwork unmarked. If we Jewish children addressed him ourselves with a question, he dismissed us with the words, "Go away, Jew," or "Be quiet, Jew." Just before Easter 1934, my parents and parents of the other Jewish children in my class received a letter from the director of the high school informing them that we should no longer come to school. So the intention of my parents to let me go to school until graduation and study had been undone. A brother of my mother was a doctor in Berlin, and it was the wish of my mother to send me to medical school to study so that I could later continue this unmarried uncle's practice. I could not sustain this type of treatment in the school any longer, in any case, and so I helped my father in his skins business until the end of 1938, when it had to be liquidated on the grounds of persecution. Kristallnacht did not take place in Zelo on the night of the 9th of November 1938 because the head of the local SA refused orders to destroy the homes of the Jewish residents. So this was done by the SS the next day. On the 10th of November, our apartment was plundered and destroyed. The looters tried to break into the safe. My father and I were arrested in our house and we were taken to Zelo, to the prison. All the other Jews in Zelo and the surrounding area had already been picked up and were loaded onto a bus. In the prison, I suffered physical cruelty by kicking and blows with rifle butts and revolvers. I was kicked in my body with heavy boots and suffered injury to my head. My back particularly suffered blows. I was so battered by the SS men that a policeman from another town took me to a local doctor who declared me unfit for imprisonment. I was taken back to the prison and then forced to reboard the bus. However, the local policeman later took me down from the bus because I had been declared unfit for detention, and he arranged for me to go home. My father was taken to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. He told us after his release that he had a nervous breakdown on the bus. A friend of my grandfather writes, a week after Kristallnacht, I visited the family home, and I will never forget the terrible impression this made on me. Completely cannibalistic destruction. I do not think all over the house there was a chair to sit on. Everything was completely destroyed. Nothing but a mountain of broken glass was left. The SA had done good and extensive work, and there was no glass left in the windows, and they had to cover the windows with newspaper. So although my father had been saved from being taken to Sachsenhausen at only 19 years old, he had already suffered at the hands of the Nazis. As chance would have it, a distant relative, a distinguished professor, Hans Gunther Reisner, used to visit my father's family and knew them well. An extract from his obituary states that he was one of those who remained in Berlin throughout the pre-war years, and that during the last months after the November pogroms, his honorary offices in the Jewish sphere included the membership of the committee in charge of the selection of applicants for the Kitchener transit camp in Richborough, Kent. There's no doubt that had my father stayed in Germany, his life would have been in danger, and I believe it was Hans Reisner who put my father's name forward for the Kitchener camp. And so on the 23rd of April, 1939, my father was able to leave Germany, traveling via Belgium. On his arrival in Dover the next day, his passport was stamped by the Kent County Constabulary as follows: leave to land is hereby granted at Dover on condition that the holder proceeds forthwith to Richborough refugee camp, registers at once with the police and remains at the camp until he emigrates. I recently discovered my father worked in the camp as a bricklayer, something which has caused me amusement because as far as I remember, he definitely wasn't very good at DIY. This is a photo from a camp propaganda magazine. It was entitled Some Victims of Nazi Terror. My father is on the left in this photo. I think the aim was to show how happily the men had settled at the camp. They were safe, they had camaraderie, but I don't think they would have been happy with their families who were still in such danger in Nazi Europe. The men weren't confined to Kitchener, although they were not supposed to live or work outside of it, and were meant to return there by 10 p.m. each night. So they were free to wander the coastline or go swimming. Some visited shops and pubs in Sandwich, and football matches against local teams were arranged. The coming of war in September 1939 brought with it new anxieties for the Kitchener refugees. It snuffed out the hope of those with wives and children still in Germany, that their families would soon be able to follow them to Britain. Also, the men were desperately concerned about all the fates of all their families left behind. The message service provided by the International Red Cross allowed the refugees to keep in touch with their families, at least for a time. The messages that I have are heartbreaking, especially in the days before war broke out. My father was one of the men who joined the Pioneer Corps, and he signed up on the 5th of December 1939, his 20th birthday. As he wrote to a cousin, I understand that you were surprised about me, but I think it is right what I have done, that I always wanted to do against the Nazis as much as I am able. After the Dunkirk evacuation in May 1940, public opinion turned against German-speaking refugees, who some suspected as being spies or saboteurs. Those not serving in the war effort were interned or deported to Australia and Canada. The Kitchener camp was closed. After the war, my father was, in common with other Kitchener men, sent back to Belgium and Germany as an interpreter. I can't imagine how that must have felt, being back in the country where his parents, sister, and almost all of the other members of his family had perished. I was never able to talk to my father about his family or his experiences during the war. He was often in pain, and all his medical reports refer to him being beaten by the Nazis. He passed away when he was just 48 years old. But strangely enough, one thing I always knew was that he had been at a place called Kitchener Camp. My father's younger brother, Joachim, had been a student at the Ort School in Berlin. The school had been set up in 1936 for Jewish children who could no longer attend mainstream school because of Nazi legislation. Under the protection of British Ort, the school survived the ravages of Kristallnacht. By 1939, when war seemed likely, the Ort leadership in Britain became so worried about the school's fate that they decided to try and evacuate the entire school with all its 215 students and teaching staff. Pressure was brought on the Home Office, and eventually the British government agreed to give visas to the students and teachers. And Ort UK sent one of its leaders, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Levy, to Berlin to finalise the arrangements. On the 25th of July 1939, my grandparents wrote to my father that my uncle had been allowed to come home for a short farewell visit and that he would soon get his passport. As my grandfather was going to Berlin to buy a suitcase for Joachim, they instructed my father to reply immediately, telling them what things they should buy that Joachim would need very urgently. I don't know what my father wrote, but they did tell him that Joachim will be bringing him back home in England some Bismarck herring. On the 29th of August 1939, 3 days before Germany invaded Poland and 24 hours after departing Berlin by train, my uncle, aged 16, was one of 106 students, 7 teachers and their spouses, all led by Colonel Levy, who arrived in Harwich after sailing from Holland. The boys were taken by train to Kitchener Camp, and for my uncle, a reunion with his brother Willie. These photos of my uncle at the camp as well, and the camp were taken by his friend Hans Futter, who was also there. Many of the boys were skilled in carpentry, plumbing, joinery and bricklaying, and were able to put these skills to good use at the camp. The boys did not stay at Kitchener long, and in December 1939, when hostel accommodation had been found and a site for their new school had been located in Leeds, the boys left the camp. Tragically, the path of the remaining 100 or so Jewish students and staff who were supposed to set off a week later was blocked by the invasion of Poland and with the declaration of war by Britain and France on Germany 2 days later. Once war had been declared, the second group, due to leave on September the 3rd, had no choice but to return to the school and resume their lessons. It's believed that none of the Ort boys left behind in the last remaining Jewish school in Berlin survived the Holocaust. In 1943, the remaining students and staff were deported to Auschwitz. The Ort boys, whose lives were saved, kept in touch for the rest of their lives and had regular reunions. An extract from one of the Ort boys to my uncle in February 1983. And the whole letter is very, very nice, but I've just kept a section. I do not think that any of us will ever forget the crowded platform at Bahnhof Charlottenburg, the crossing of the border, the ferry, the march to Whitechapel, the spontaneous welcome that the Jews of Whitechapel gave us, the green countryside of Kent, the Kitchener camp, the visitors' room, the first contact with other refugees from Germany and Austria, and even several escapees from German concentration camps, the air raids and the filling of sandbags, the excursions to Sandwich, Ramsgate, and Margate. In 2019, the 80th anniversary of Kitchener Camp was recognised when a plaque sponsored by AJR was unveiled outside the Bell Hotel in Sandwich, which was a favorite meeting place for the refugees. I hope that 2022 will mark another building block in the raised level of public awareness of one of the lesser known acts of rescue in Britain's Second World War history. And thanks are due to the AJR for recently granting the Kitchener Descendants group the status of a special interest group, joining the Kindertransport and child survivor groups, which already enjoy that status. 4,000 lives were saved, and yet many more, of course, were not. And as we approach Holocaust Memorial Day, I want to dedicate these words to those millions who, unlike my father and uncle, did not make it to a safe haven. May their memory be for a blessing.
Thank you very much, Vivian, sharing that very moving reflection, and an honourable mention to David for organising the screen slides. As well as Rabbi Botnick, we are indebted also to Dr. Cantor Paul Heller from Belsize Square Synagogue, who will lead us now in a rendition of Shema Kolenu. Dr. Heller.
Thank you, Michael, and good afternoon, everyone. Before I start, I would like to read a short translation. You have it in the programs. The words of Shema Kolenu: accept our prayer, O God, and our supplication. Hear us, hear our voice. O Lord, look graciously upon us and grant thy loving kindness, thy mercy and forgiveness to us who stand before thee. Thank you, Mike, and thank you, AGR.
Thank you very much, Paul, Dr. Heller. Our next speaker is Meriel Schindler, herself no stranger to the AJR, having spoken movingly as part of our Zoom events last year. We're delighted she's joining us again to talk about the story of the lost Café Schindler, her moving book which weaves together memoir, family history, and an untold story of the Jews of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It explores the restorative power of writing and offers readers a profound reflection on memory, truth, trauma, and the importance of cake. Meriel.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's very much an honour to be with you this afternoon and to be celebrating Holocaust Memorial Day with you. It's particularly, I think, poignant for me because I grew up or was brought up in a way that entirely denied me my Jewish heritage. My father married out, and when we arrived as two girls in his life, his daughters, he told us repeatedly in no uncertain terms that we should never, ever, ever tell anyone that we were Jewish. This was something to be kept hidden. Now, in some ways, as the child of the Holocaust, of that era, who arrived here aged 13 as a refugee, not on the Kindertransport, but under his own steam, I can perhaps understand why someone of that era would say that, but it nevertheless had a very profound effect on me. I was a rebellious child and I was always interested in my Jewish heritage. And as I grew up, I tended to date Jewish men and indeed married a Jewish man and have 3 children with him. So his efforts to stifle my interest in Judaism didn't work. But nevertheless, I have a very, very healthy dose of imposter syndrome sitting here in front of you. When my father died in 2017, I was filled with a lot of remorse and many questions. The remorse related to the fact that I had had a very strained and difficult relationship with him. He was a tricky man. He lied about things, not to put too fine a point on it. That may have been because that was how he was, or it may have been because he was affected by what had happened in his life. And as I started to think about him and the stories he told us, I was very much filled with a desire to find out what he had said, whether anything that he'd told us as children was true. And the things that he had told us were essentially, events on Kristallnacht, things that he said he had witnessed, and a lot about a family business that we had lost, and a family business that he had spent his entire adult life litigating to regain. And I wanted to, I suppose, just understand a man who I'd found utterly maddening throughout my adult life. And I started to research my family story. And my story is very much the story of a very, very ordinary family. It's a very ordinary middle-class family running a business in Western Austria. The thing that was unusual about Western Austria was that there were actually very, very few Jews there. There were about 500 Jews in Innsbruck, where my family lived. They formed a tiny fraction of the population. And this was a population that was not particularly observant. They didn't have their own synagogue. They had a prayer room, but they rubbed along very, very well with their neighbours. My grandfather and my great-grandfather gave money to charity. They employed lots of people in their business, regardless of their faith, etc. And I think that it's what I think was so striking for me about researching the story was that this was not Vienna. This was a tiny, tiny provincial town where everyone knew everyone. And when my grandfather was beaten up on Kristallnacht, he was beaten up by people he knew, by people who'd served in the same regiment as him. And one of the, I think, incredibly important acts of remembrance around this whole topic is to understand that that level of hatred can come out of nowhere, can infect people who, to all intents and purposes, were friends and neighbours. And I think that's very important, that these were not strangers who beat up my grandfather. Now, the book itself is called The Lost Café Schindler. It comes out in paperback this week, which I think is a particularly striking thing that they've chosen this week. And it revolves around a cafe, and the cafe, in a sense, the story of the cafe is just another way of framing the whole Holocaust story and explaining it to future generations. The cafe itself was founded by my great-grandfather. He fought as a citizen of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as a proud, proud soldier in the First World War. He fought on the Southern Front, which was a murderously horrific front between Austria and what is now Italy. And he fought up in the mountains. And he survived. He was a decorated soldier. And when he returned to Innsbruck after the First World War, his reaction to the economic desolation he found was almost frivolous. It was to found a cafe where people could fall in love and dance, and above all, eat incredible cake and coffee. And that was his mission. That was what he did. Roll on to 1938, the Nazis arrived. By this point, the cafe was the meeting place, the social hub of Innsbruck. And one of the first things they wanted to do was take the cafe off my grandfather. He was forced to sell it to a leading Nazi, who himself was a black marketeer and nearly ended up in front of the firing squad. Had it not been for the importance of the cafe to Nazi morale, he would have been shot. But he wasn't, and he then served out his Nazi era at the cafe for 7 years, running it. At the end of the war, the Nazis scarpered largely into hiding. All the senior ones did anyway in my area. And my grandfather returned to Austria. He was one of the very, very few Jews to return, let alone to Western Austria, where there had been very few Jews in the first place. And he set about rebuilding the cafe again and opening it for his local population. And it was bomb damaged, he reopened, and again, there was dancing, there was music, there was good cake, there was coffee in this amazing place. Sadly, he died in 1952, probably prematurely as the result of the way he'd been beaten up on Kristallnacht during the November pogrom. And my father inherited the cafe. He fell out with all and sundry, and the cafe was eventually sold, and it disappeared off the high street. And when I went to school in Austria in the early 80s, it had long, long gone. There was no remnant of it, there was no plaque, there was nothing. And yet, when I mentioned my name, Schindler, to people, when I went to school, when I spoke to parents, they all remembered the cafe because it had lived on in their memories and in their love of that particular place. And 10 years ago, a young restaurateur from Salzburg who knew nothing about the cafe arrived in Innsbruck and wanted to open a cafe in the very same building. And an extraordinary thing happened, because no matter where he asked, whether it was in the planning office or the licensing office or his brother-in-law, they all said to him, it has to be called Café Schindler. He didn't know these people, and he looked us up and realized that by giving it that name, he would give it that heritage, and he would, in doing so, remember the people who'd originally founded it. And it's now very special. I don't own it. I've been there, obviously, but I love the fact that this year it'll celebrate its 100th anniversary. And it is the only previously Jewish founded and owned business that's still going in Innsbruck. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meriel. And I highly recommend to everybody reading a copy of the book. I would now like to, and by the way, you can read more about Meriel, who's featured in the February edition of the AJR Journal, which is out next week. I would now like to welcome back Cantor Heller to recite the memorial prayer for victims of the Holocaust, El Melech Rachamim, the English translation of which will be read by Neil Martin, Chief Executive of the Jewish Lads and Girls Brigade. Rabbi Botnick will then lead us in reciting the Kaddish, for which you are invited to participate, and Cantor Heller will conclude the service by singing Psalm 23. Cantor Heller.
El Melech Rachamim shochem b'mromim Hamtzei menucha nechona al kanfei השכינה במעלות קדושים וטהורים כזוהר רקיע מזרים לנשמות 600 ריבות מעם ישראל גברים, נשים וטף שנהרגו ושנשחקו ושנשרפו ונשרפו תחת ממשלת הנאצים ומשתתפי פעולתם. בעבור שאנו מתפללים לעילוי נשמותיכם, לכם בעל הרחמים יסתירם בסתר כנפיו לעולמים. ויצרור ויצרור החיים את נשמתם, אדוני ונחלתם. בגן עדן תהא מנוחתם. וינוחו בשלום על משכבם, ונאמר אמן.
God, full of compassion, who dwells on high, grant infinite rest in your sheltering presence among the echelons of the holy and pure, who shine like the radiant sky, to 6 million souls of our Jewish brethren, men, women, and children, who were killed, slaughtered, burned, and exterminated by the murderous Nazi regime and their enablers. May the memories of these innocent victims be a sanctification of God's name. O compassionate one, we ask that you hold these souls in your sheltering embrace for all eternity, and that they be bound up in the bond of life. Adonai is their portion. May their external home be a true paradise, and may they rest in peace. And let us say, Amen.
Amen. Please join me in reciting Mourner's Kaddish, wherever you are. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, v'alma divrach irutei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayechon uv'yomechon uv'chayedecho Beit Yisrael, b'agala uv'izman kariv v'imiru, Amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam omei amaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, v'yitadar v'yitalev v'yithalal shemei dekudsha b'rechu. Le'ela min kol berchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechamata, damiran v'alma v'imuru, amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chaim alenu v'al kol Yisrael v'imuru, amen. Oseh shalom b'romav, hu ya'aseh shalom, alenu v'al kol Yisrael v'imuru, amen. May the one who makes peace in the heavens above make peace for us, for all of Israel, and for all of humanity. And let us say, amen.
Amen.
Cantor Heller.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our service for Holocaust Memorial Day. A special thank you to our candle lighters, to our speakers, Hedy, Vivian and Meriel, to Rabbi Botnick and Cantor Heller for officiating, and to my colleagues for putting together the program and helping to deliver the event. Lastly, a big thank you to you all for joining us. It is always greatly appreciated that you join us in such strong numbers for our online events, but we very much hope to see you in person in the near future. Keep well, take care, and auf Wiedersehen.